Ready? Okay. Good morning, brothers. Today, the last class of the year, we're going to dedicate this unit to Moliere. Moliere. I want to give a general introduction to French theater, but then I'm going to focus on Moliere, of whom you have the Tartuffe in the anthology. And I still hope we're going to get some extra time for you to ask any questions regarding the final exam. The main source for this lecture was Shakespeare and Moliere, a study by Katia Chacon, but there are a few other sources that I have used to prepare this lecture, including, of course, the production of Moliere himself. And French theater. French theater developed later than Spanish and than English theater. And if English theater was not well accepted by everyone, well, French theater even less. And it took a long time for the French theater to be accepted. For example, magistrates and also covering a position could not attend the theater until Louis XIV, I will not say opened, but at least mitigated some of the regulations and some of the laws that banned theater from society. So it was always regarded as a low, as not only menial, but almost immoral task. And commendable, a reputable person could not attend the theater and much less take an active part in the theater. And this is one of the reasons why French theater developed a lot later, and it developed in a very confined context, because unlike the Spanish theater that was mostly popular and it was a theater meant for the great masses, French theater was reserved for the aristocracy and the nobility, and especially the monarchy. Okay, so it was a lot more refined, and that's the reason why in 1634 the Royal French Academy was founded to maintain and to make sure, to ensure that all the norms of classical theater were observed in any dramatic production. They also wanted to follow all the classical standards. For example, the whole action had to be framed within a single place and a single 24-hour span. So those were some of the classical norms, which, by the way, sometimes were violated. For example, by Pierre Corneille in his tragedy on the Spanish hero El Cid. He wrote a tragedy that violated practically all the canons of classical tragedy, and the dispute became so harsh that Pierre Corneille had to end up retiring. He dedicated himself to translating the Imitation of Christ. Really, yes. And then he made a lot of amendments, but to the production he had written. But the regulations that were standardizing French theater were very rigid, very precise. In addition, it had always the whole action had to be covered within 3 acts. There could not be any mixture of tragedy and comedy. So if you bring a comical element, it has to be within a comedy and only within a comedy. If you bring a tragic element, it has to be only within a tragic setting. For example, that a work like that of Hamlet by Shakespeare would be completely inadmissible, because of course it's a tragedy, but from time to time he also inserts some humor to ease tension. For example, when Hamlet, who is the Prince of Denmark, is sent to England. Why? Because he was mad, and they were hoping that he would be healed from his madness, or at least that it wouldn't show because they're in England, everyone is mad. And of course everybody laughed because that was represented in England. So there are some moments where Hamlet releases the tension through comical passages, or there are a few others, but for example, what are you reading? Words. Okay, that's comical. Okay. There are a few comical passages that would be completely inadmissible according to the standards of classical theater. They also, of course, regulated what was represented in the scenes for it to be moral, for it to be decent, for it to be commendable, and the language. Was it a good language? Was it a refined language? Was it an elegant language? Was it according to the standards of grammar? Okay, so the Royal French Academy was overseeing practically everything that was produced for the theater, and sometimes these molds were broken, and that always brought a lot of problems and a lot of controversies. Okay, Pierre Corneille is the father of French tragedy, so we owe to him the initiation, but it was taken to its splendor by Jean Racine. I might get this wrong, but I'm almost sure Jean Racine and Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, Moliere, were partners at a time, and then they split because Jean Racine betrayed, and he sold the same production that he had sold Moliere, he sold it to someone else. But I'm not entirely sure on this detail. I will have to check, but I'm not sure there was some foul play between them sometime. So, having mentioned these two great proponents of French tragedy, Pierre Corneille, who was born in 1606 and died in 1684, and Jean Racine, who was born in 1639 and died in 1699, I will dedicate the rest of this unit to Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, whose stage name was Moliere. Let me just press fast forward and explain why his stage name, and his name for academic circles has always been Moliere. He detached himself from his last name, Poquelin, because he didn't want to cast any blame or any dishonor on his family. It was not reputable for anyone to partake in theatrical productions, and he not only took part, but he made a living out of theatrical productions, and that is why he relinquished his last name, Poquelin, and he was named, and then he was known, and he was commended to posterity with his stage name, Moliere. He was born in 1622 and died in 1673. I repeat, 1622 and died in 1673. He is the creator of French comedy. He tried to write some tragedies. He tried to act in some tragedies, but he was affected with a chronic hiccup and a chronic cough that would make any tragical attempt comedic. So that was not for him. But on the other hand, he was very successful with comedy, both as a producer and as an actor. And in him, above all, we have a great businessman who knew how to make a living from his production. He was educated by the Jesuits, but soon enough he abandoned his faith and embraced some Epicurean philosophy. And it's not sure, but it's speculated with some degree of certainty that he was led by the professor Gassendi. Gassendi. Pope Benedict speaks about him in his encyclical Deus Caritas Est, because Gassendi, an Epicurean, that dedicated himself to material things and to the body, mocked René Descartes, because René Descartes said cogito ergo sum. So for him, our body is just a mere instrument, a mere tool, and we are souls. We are our soul, and we happen to use the body. happen to have a body, according to Descartes, right? So Gassendi, this is practically literally almost a quote, almost a literal quote from Deus Caritas Est. Gassendi, mocking Descartes, hailed him and he said, "Hail, O soul," to which Descartes responded, "Hail, O flesh." And you can also see some echoes of Lucretius, the Epicurean and materialistic Latin poet. So you can see that this is what he embraced. And as far as it has to do with piety and some sense of transcendence, you will not find it in his production. In any case, you will find some echoes of popular piety, and most of the times it's going to be to mock that popular piety. Okay? He attempted studying law, but he abandoned those studies to dedicate himself completely to his theatrical production in 1643. It was then when he changed his name from Vauquelin to Moliere to distance himself and also to protect the honor of his family. And he was able to make a living with his theatrical production, to a significant extent also because he was favored by Louis XIV. So I have spoken about a very harsh regulation and how the theater was banned, but this was eased by Louis XIII, and then it was further eased by Louis XIV. And you will see that theater and acting was never well accepted, even to the end of the life of Moliere. Moliere could not be, well, there was a struggle to have him buried on a Christian cemetery. I'll get there after his death, but just so you see that although Louis XIV favored theatrical productions, it was never fully received and it was never fully accepted. He was very successful. First, because he enjoyed the favor of Louis XIV, and second, because he was also creative. He was very humorous. He was well received. He also created new characters, and if he had some failures in his career, they were due rather to intrigue rather than from any fault of his own. And especially those intrigues came from the nobility and the clergy, which were often plotting against him. For example, the Tartuffe that you have in the anthology. According to Moliere's production, the Tartuffe was represented by, with a man wearing a cassock. So it was a clergyman. Okay, among many other things that we can see in his production. And he mocks novelty, he mocks aristocracy, he mocks the clergy, and he mocks doctors, those devoted to the medical profession. Those would be his four main targets: okay? Aristocrats, noblemen, the clergy, and the doctors, physicians. Do you see someone he's not mocking at all?
The king.
The crown, exactly, the king. Why? Because he had always received the favor of the king. And in spite of all the corruption that you can find in Tartuffe, what happens in the end? The king comes, almost like a deus ex machina, and solves everything. So that was, he was always very favored by the king. And you see that also as a constant in his production. He never touches, not even from a distance. He never touches the crown. So he's very respectful toward the king. Maybe his aversion and his mockery against doctors and against those embracing the medical profession came because one of his sons died, and allegedly, at least this was Moliere's point of view, his son had died because of the ill advice of physicians. So there are at least two. One is a physician in spite of himself, and the other one is the imaginary invalid in which the main character is a hypochondriac. So in one of his plays, he stages someone trying to embrace the medical profession, and all he needed to do is to rhyme to Latin verses. So once you get that, you are an accomplished doctor. Let me read you this, for example, from Malgré lui, which in English is translated as the physician in spite of himself. The physician in spite of himself, or you can also find it translated as the doctor in spite of himself. So, Guéron has a daughter, and his daughter has gone dumb. She cannot speak. And he comes to Sgarnel, that is the doctor. But it's the cause of her complaint that we are seeking. I maintain, because she lost the power of speaking. So why did she go dumb? Because she has lost the power of speaking. So this is how intuitive doctors can be. Okay. But why has she no longer the power of speaking? Through failure of the lip or the tongue. Apropos, on this point, Aristotle has concurred. Let me see. You're fluent in Latin, of course. Garon. Not so much as a word. Sgarnel. Oh, no Latin, not even a word. So he continues the dialogue, and he says, Cabricias, archituram, catalamus, etc. Yes. And the result, qui substantive. Tyrannosaurus rex, amo, amas, amare. Now to review my line of reasoning, I maintain that is the impediment of the action of the tongue is caused by the certain humors, which we learn in circles called the peccant humors, or in other words, humors that are peccant, passing from the liver on the left to the heart on the right. They converge in the lungs, where they encounter vapors emanating from the ventricles of their scapula or shoulder's blade. I urge you to follow my reasoning closely. And all the attendants say, yes, indeed. Osabandus, nequis, nequer, potiarum, quipsa, milus. And that, in simple words, is precisely why your daughter is speechless. Okay. So what did the doctor do here? What did the doctor say here? Nothing. He just babbled, and according to, of course, here Moliere is mocking what the doctors did. Of course, he's exaggerating, but that is the way he envisioned, and that's the way he portrayed the doctors. And by the way, this line, this is precisely why your daughter is speechless, is even nowadays in French, a famous line when someone doesn't want to give an explanation. Okay, and he explains things in a very obscure way, just to confuse, and he ends up saying, and this is precisely, et voici pourquoi votre fille est muette. And this is precisely why your daughter is speechless. I've already mentioned that he tried to write tragedy, but that was not successful for him. But he did succeed in comedy, and as his illness of chronic coughing became more and more intense, he created for himself Argon. Argon was a hypochondriac. So when he was on stage, if he was affected by some chronic coughing, that would flow with the play. Do you see? Because he was always pretending to be ill. So even if he coughed during a performance, that went well with the flow of of the play. That is the Imaginary Invalid, which was published, which came to production the very year of his death, 1673. Now, during a performance of the Imaginary Invalid, he started coughing more and more. And all those who were watching said, "Oh, that's a remarkable performance." Then he fainted. And they said, maybe that was not a performance. And they tried to revive him. They took him back to his home, but no physician attended. Of course. No doctor came to assist him. And no priest came to assist him. So they called a priest, he didn't come. I think they called a second priest, the second priest didn't come. The third reluctantly came, but Moliere died when the third priest was on his way. And that was the end of Moliere. Moliere's wife pleaded before the king to have him buried on a Christian cemetery. And the regulations were so strict that that was completely banned because he was an actor and he had dishonored himself and he had cast blame upon himself by embracing that profession. So he was not admitted to being buried on holy ground, on a Christian cemetery, but his wife continued to plead, and in the end they came to a compromise, and he was buried in the section of the cemetery reserved for unbaptized infants. So that's where Moliere was buried. Okay. Are there any questions about Moliere? And if there are, and after we finish these questions, we finish the session. We stop recording, and I'll open the space just for any questions you might have regarding the final exam or the course in general. Yes.
Can you repeat why he didn't like physicians?
He didn't like. We are not sure, but first of all, because they were academics, right? So it's likely that his son had died because there was an ill advice from behalf of a physician. Okay, so the treatment that a physician had suggested for his son was wrong, and that is what brought his son to his grave. We are not entirely sure, but it might very well be the reason why he always targeted physicians. Okay. Yes.
Was he Baptist?
Moliere?
Yeah.
Yes. He was born a Catholic. He was educated with the Jesuits, but eventually he abandoned his Catholic faith and embraced Epicurean philosophy. And in his works, you can see that materialistic mindset. Okay.
And then you said that, like, I guess theater in general wasn't fully accepted or received. But you said that he was well received?
He was well received as a performer. His production was well received. Okay. Yes, so people went to watch him, especially in the aristocracy and in the nobility. But that doesn't mean that the profession of an actor was well regarded or ever became reputable in his time.
And then you said that the clergy pursued him or something?
Yes. As I said, his target was those devoted to the medical profession, the aristocrats, the nobility, and the clergy. Right. And he also mocks fake religion. He mocks popular piety. He mocks hypocrisy. He mocks bigotry, and even the Tartuffe, which you have in the anthology. Just be mindful of this. The Tartuffe was represented with someone wearing a cassock. So actually, Orgon meets the Tartuffe where? At church. Okay, so Orgon was very naive precisely because of his popular piety. So he was deceived by the hypocrisy of the Tartuffe. That is one among several instances where he mocks the clergy, and that is why the clergy didn't accept him, didn't regard him, didn't welcome him, and in some instances they even tried to undermine his production, and I have already spoken about his last hours, how he died unassisted by a priest.
What was the legacy?
Oh yes, well, that's a good question, because it has been criticized that Moliere didn't add anything to grammar, for example. Actually, his grammar is a regression, right? He didn't fully comply with the standards of the French Royal Academy. And that's been a criticism against Moliere, that he didn't add anything other than that comedian tone. In addition, when it comes to his comedy, even his comedy has been criticized because his characters are one-sided. They are stereotypical characters. Of course, he doesn't get close by any means to the depth of a Shakespearean character. Right? So yeah, he has also been criticized for that. Let me see if I have some other notes about that, about Moliere's legacy.
And to the question, you can speak earlier about the context, like related with the legacy.
Yes, the context is the late Baroque. So it's what you have seen in art like the Rococo period. Okay, so that goes in consonance with grandiloquence and that fascination for external appearances and for the form. Right? So it is late Baroque, and to a certain extent, you can also say that it is an exaggerated Baroque. Yeah, that's the context. You can also find plenty of material when you think about Louis XIV, that is has been also named the Sun King, not the Sun but the Sun, and Richelieu, Cardinal Richelieu. Yes, Cardinal Richelieu was. I think the position is called a regent because the king was still a child, so it was Cardinal Richelieu who took public affairs in his hands, and he did a lot to increase French splendor, not only in the arts but also militarily and socially. So it's also important, and it's interesting to see how if the 16th century belonged mostly to Spain, how the 17th century, when Spanish splendor is at its demise, French splendor starts rising. Yes, so that is the context. You can study that more in depth when it comes to history, but that is the context where it is framed. And just thinking about his legacy, well, even if his grammar was not refined, and some might argue that he regressed in this regard and that his characters are stereotypical, nonetheless his legacy is worth taking into consideration because he has given French many sentences or idioms. For example, arpagon, which, from Greek arpatsein, was the name of the greedy person to whom he dedicates one of his plays. So, or tartuffe, even in today's French, to call someone a tartuffe means exactly what you have in the production. So those are names or words that have been incorporated into French thanks to Moliere. And I also mentioned voici pourquoi votre fille est muette, and this is why your daughter went speechless. Okay, so I think in French is statut de commendateur, the statue of a commander, because in his Don Juan. Yeah, the Don Juan that you know that has been represented by Tirso de Molina and Mozart and many others. Moliere himself has his Don Juan. So his depiction of the commander in the final scene, that has also been labeled as a stern figure that is pitiless and that has no mercy and that cannot be moved. So although he was criticized in his time and he's even criticized in our times, nonetheless he has a lasting legacy in the words and in the idioms that he has given to French language. Yes.
I was just going to ask two very brief questions. When was the Royal French Academy founded again?
1634.
And then who was the Epicurean mentor of?
Gassendi. It's speculated, it's not sure, but it's likely that Gassendi was his professor. Gassendi. Gassendi. Gassendi.
Well, why was John Racine important again?
And he's the climax of French tragedy. As you see, today's lecture was mostly dedicated to French comedy, but you have to be aware that there's also this element of French theater, which is tragedy, and it was initiated by Pierre Corneille, and it was carried to its completion by Jean Racine. So they are also great French playwrights, and yeah, those are the three greatest French playwrights, at least during this age.
Can you share with us some personal fruits or things that you have enjoyed while reading Moliere?
What is enjoyable about Moliere? All the advice that you find, for example, in the Tartuffe, is very sound advice if it were not framed within a comedy. So being framed within a comedy, you can only see it as a mockery. So if I give you some commendable words of how to behave in this or that other situation, or if I tell you what the scale of values, so for example, times change and I am thankful for that, or this house needs austerity. If you read those sentences and if you found them in Sophocles, you would say, "Wow, those are great sentences. Those are great thoughts. Yes, those are great mottos, and they can be inspiring, right?" Moliere takes all those great mottos and mocks them. Okay, so even if they are very sound mottos, and even if that can be envisioned and regarded as a very good advice, yes, when you frame it within a comedy, you cannot take it seriously. You cannot take it seriously. Okay, I want to say a few more things about that. Just let me put my ideas together. For example, coming back to Hamlet, when you think about the advice that Polonius gives to his son Laertes, you take those sentences of themselves and you see that they are very sound, that they are it's a very good piece of advice, right? That those are sentences that can help you lead your life and lead your life honestly. Now, when you put them in mouth of Polonius, you can always suspect there's some thwarted intention, right? So those sentences that could be in themselves very highly regarded can be questioned when you see where they are framed. And although it can look like a secondary character, the Tartuffe wouldn't be the same and wouldn't be what it is without the handmaid, Dorine. Yes, so she is like the moral conscience that is always making comments, and she's nosy and she gets into everything. So there are private conversations, and she eardrops. You say? Yes, she eardrops and hears what they are saying, and she makes her comments. But at the same time, she's very upfront. She's very blunt. So I think that paying attention to the character of Dorine is also very enjoyable. Yes?
There was something specific that French comedy had and another comedies did not?
It was mostly dedicated to royalty. Yes, and it honors the crown, and it was dedicated mostly for the aristocracy. So when it comes to Spanish theater and English theater, both of them were mostly dedicated for common people, for the masses, and instead French theater is dedicated for an elite, for an upper class, for aristocrats. Okay, first, and as a follow-up or as a consequence of this, refinement. So those elements that you might see that were not so polished and not so refined in Spanish or in English theater are very, very polished in French theater. Let me give you a very clear example, which is ballet. So ballet is a very elegant dance, as you know, right? And Louis XIV himself, the great king, was also a ballet dancer.
No.
Yeah. Masculine standards also shaped through history. Okay, so sometimes Moliere also cooperated with Charpentier or other composers to stage ballet, and that refined dance came together with French theater to give you an idea of how elevated it could be, right? And when you compare that with Shakespearean or with Shakespearean theater or the theater of the Spanish golden century, you cannot fit a ballet there in any way, right? So refinement. That would be one of the key aspects that separates French theater from English and Spanish theater.